Hello and welcome. I'm John Swisher, the Vice President of Sales at CareWorks, and I'll be your host for today's webinar, a deeper dive into reporting dashboards. So we had really great attendance and feedback on our last reporting dashboards webinar a couple weeks ago, and we heard you. So we brought the topic back for a more technical look at the product and show you how you can get started yourself with relative ease. Now, before I introduce my fellow presenter, a few housekeeping items. So we've muted the attendees' microphones, but we want to make sure you're able to engage with us. So please do utilize the chat box feature to drop questions on the topic or share your struggles, experiences, etc. And we will be recording today's webinar. So we'll share a link to the session for you to revisit or share with your colleagues afterwards. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Smith. For the past 6 years, Dan's been serving as CareWorks Senior Sales Engineer, putting to use his more than 17 years of experience implementing OnBase and CareWorks solutions in the payer and provider space. So Dan's recorded 2 videos to get us started today, and folks are probably thinking, well, why are we watching a video? We're on a webinar. Well, it's important. We just want to walk through them quickly on today's session, and we'll be following up again along with today's recording, but those recordings narrated for you to reference as needed. And I think it's technically one video, but one part is getting report services into reporting dashboards, and the other is loading sample dashboards into your solution. So it's an easy way to get started, and those dashboards are universal. And after we talk through those, it's really time to hear from you. So we have some best practices to show, but we're excited to see your questions. So go ahead and start thinking of them now, typing them in now ahead of time so we can walk through them later. Dan, you ready to kick us off?
Yeah, let's do it. Thanks for the intro. All right, so I did start this pretty basic at the very beginning, logging into Community. If I can get this to start. There we go. Yeah, so we're logging into Community. We're going to search for reporting dashboard samples. Once we get that, we will download those samples and then import them through the Unity client.
So Dan, these are essentially free dashboards provided by Highland that will work with any OnBase solution?
Yeah, exactly. These are more administrative kind of overview that don't go into, we don't know the custom solutions you built. So these will look at general workflows and stuff like that. But, there's 6 or 7 reports that come in this. They're all detailed out in this Word document. Once we get that, we can log into Unity, go to reporting, administration, and then we're going to import the configuration. We just browse out to what we downloaded. Once we select the SQL or Oracle database, depending on what you have, we'll create unmatched items. We'll run the verification and then proceed to import. And I think it took 10, 15 seconds to run that in. Once those are in there, you could, essentially what we have to do is add permissions to these dashboards. So it brings in a category, which is kind of like a folder that's where those reports are going to be stored. So we have to add whatever user groups or users that you want to give access to those reports within there. So once we find those reports in our list, we can go through, and then at the top in the ribbon, there's the assign users, where we can add those users. I'm just adding the manager user in my demonstration system. It's just the easiest, but your user might be different. And we'll do the same for the dashboards.
And so, Dan, can you kind of quickly describe for folks not familiar, what is the difference between a dashboard and the data provider itself?
Yeah, definitely. So the dashboard is the visual front end, the graphs, and all the data that you're bringing back. The data provider, if you're someone that knows SQL, is essentially what brings the data that you're going to use to display in the dashboard. So that can be a custom SQL data provider, or there's some pre-built data providers within reporting dashboards for workflow document types where you don't need to know SQL.
Very good. Awesome.
So on the screen now, you see the sample dashboards we brought in, the data that's coming through these. And this is right off the bat. I didn't really have to do anything other than give myself rights so that I can view these. Once it's
Sorry, Dan, I noticed as you're pulling each one of these up in the video and you're kind of setting these, whether it be document types or a date time frame, is there a reason why these are kind of set up to prompt you for certain items of data like this?
Yeah, definitely. It's essentially to restrict what you're bringing up so you're not, shutting down or overloading the database. If we could restrict that data down to a certain level, that makes the report run with less of a load on the database. Also, in this case, since they're providing these samples, they really don't know what you're going to be looking at. So they're giving you a way to look up that data through those drop downs. After this video is over, I'll go in and I'll show how we can take one of these reports and customize it so that you can remove those parameters, basically have it go directly to a workflow of our choosing and display only that data so you can have
Awesome.
pinpointed.
Very good.
Yeah, so just going through showing you what's in there, the examples. Coming up next will be the reporting services migration into reporting dashboards. So very similar to the way we downloaded, those downloads are in community. The difference, you're not going to be importing and export from the Unity client. You're going to be creating a data provider, and the new data provider is going to be the XML file that you're going to import from community. So very similar after that first initial choice of creating from an export. You're going to add those users that you want to have rights to that data provider. The big difference between the sample export and the report services export is that it only creates data providers. So you will have to manually create the front end dashboard, the user interface for those reports. That could be simple, a report where it's just the data, or you can create the dashboards themselves.
Okay, so and if I'm going back to some of those reports that came out of the box with report services, from a visual perspective, those are pretty simple and straightforward, right? So I mean, recreating something like that in here, and I think we'll probably see that here and even later.
Yep.
Pretty straightforward when we look at it as to what we used to have to do in the former product, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, so what I'm doing here, since a lot of the report services conversions come in without the data formatted, I'm just formatting the data that we're bringing in so that it shows up correctly. And you just go to Format, choose the type and the units, and then that will show up in the correct format there. So once that is saved, you could go to your gallery and that production license report will show up. And this is, you'll see in the categories of the reporting dashboards, there is a section for just reports. And what that indicates is that it's just a standard kind of like an Excel view of the data. It's not a dashboard.
So a simplified view. Okay.
Yep.
Now, for folks that have, taken what was out of the box with reporting services, report services, and have created their own reports, there is a tool now to be able to extract all of those and create those same data providers that you just did and download it directly from community as well. So for those of you who have really taken advantage of that and are afraid of possibly losing those in a move to dashboards, the hard part is done from a data provider perspective. It's really up to you, just mimic that same look and feel or possibly enhance it even further.
Yep. Yeah, and that's exactly what we'll do now really quick before we start taking questions. These are the sample reports we brought in. We have the queue contents here. This is the parameters that normally would pop up and ask your users to enter. Let's see, if we do AP invoice processing, we would have to select all these and then run it. So if we wanted to create a new report from these existing reports that is more tailored to a certain user group, a certain department, maybe you already have a workflow set up for them, it's really easy as long as you have rights. There's a copy to new button up here. The first question is, would you like to make copies of the data provider as well? And we're going to say yes, so that we can get rid of that, those parameters that pop up. So yes, I'm going to rename this to AP invoice processing. This is where we're selecting those parameters. In this case, we're going to uncheck the prompt user select queue at runtime because we're going to manually select that from this select queues option here. Once that comes up, we can choose AP processing. If you choose the lifecycle, it'll automatically pick all the queues underneath. So if you have any hidden queues or stuff you don't want people to see, you make sure you go in and uncheck those. I'm going to click OK. We're going to go next. If you have any security keywords, you can respect that, or load balancing. From here, we're not going to add any parameters. Click next. These are all the fields we're going to bring in. One thing to keep in mind, if you want to make these interactive, you have to have either the content ID, that's kind of the document ID, what workflow calls it, or a lifecycle ID. You have to have that like configuration ID level of data field within there to retrieve that. So
that's a good point, Dan. And one other thing to bring up with that. So if it's, it's the document, the document handle, but if it's opening up a workflow queue, right, you need that queue ID and the lifecycle ID. And if it's a work view object, you need the work view class and the object ID, right? So those are important things to keep in mind. And if we get to it, I think one of the other ways that we've seen this and kind of cheated in the past is almost hard code those when needed. If you know that you're always opening those up, why make it difficult yourself and try and bring those over when you can hard code it? A lot of ways we've done that with the calculated fields, but please continue, Dan.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this may lead into another webinar idea, but just being able to create for our work view customers, you can create a report filter within WorkView that will automatically come across to the reporting dashboard's data provider. So just thinking out loud here, another idea for a webinar.
Might happen, Dan.
Yeah. So once we add those users we want to give rights to, we could click finish there. And now we're creating the dashboard portion. So that first one was the data provider. I'm going to rename this to match. You can leave the same description or tailor it to whichever workflow you're going in there. If you want to make it public so that everyone can see it, you can add it there, or respect permissions. I'll do next. I'm just going to have the manager here. Again, the same users, and then finish. So what this is bringing up is that new report for AP invoice processing only. So if there's any additional manipulation we want to do to this, we can do it at this point. I'm just going to save it and close it at this point, and then go in and show one quick thing.
And while you're getting to that, Dan, just to kind of reset and recap what Dan did here. So that was one of the dashboards that you just downloaded from Community, correct?
Correct.
And so, Dan may be downloading this into a demonstration VM that has plenty of different workflows for him to choose from and be able to sample from. But, think about your existing OnBase instance. I'm sure that many of the folks on the line right now have workflows, have existing workflows that they've built with the help of CureWorks, so on and so forth, and maybe missing some of that insight into it. Now, in about 5 to 10 minutes, we saw Dan download that, import it in, and then create a custom dashboard for a workflow that was already in existence. And the only real configuration he did was setting up which workflow we wanted to see, and then potentially sharing that out even further. And it looks like he has just a little bit more he wants to add to it. So I'll turn it back to him.
Thank you. Yeah, so on that, I don't know if I glazed over it or I didn't see it, but the display actions that I mentioned earlier. So being able to open up the workflow or open up a document from that report. Let me back up a little bit here. Essentially, I found my dashboard. I'm going to properties, display actions, add the dashboard item. So this is the actual item on the visual dashboard that you created. I know it's the Q contents, and we're going to display a document. And like I said before, that the data we're using to retrieve that document is the content ID. So that's the unique value. That might be doc ID if it's a document dashboard. Since this is a workflow, it's a content ID. And then once we click OK,
and a quick tip for folks for when that is not appearing, it just needs to be part of that certain part of the dashboard. That's something that I know I've probably ripped a couple of hairs out of my head trying to figure out late at night. It's as simple as the piece of data needs to be shown in there for you to be able to choose it.
Exactly. So on my screen now is that sample dashboard, Q contents and entry time monitoring. the new dashboard I created is a pair AP invoice processing. When I click that, no longer prompted to enter in those parameters. We have it, going into the AP invoice processing. It's filterable, so each of these graphs are clickable, and we could clear those filters by clicking the clear button. If we wanted to view any invoice exceptions and get those worked on quickly, we just click on that filter. And then we have the queue content section in the bottom right, where we can easily double click and go directly to that document, review any notes, and we can perform any workflow actions directly from that document, from the dashboard. So not just a reporting tool, but it could be a user interface for your everyday users.
Yeah, that's a really good point that we're starting to see more and more of is, users aren't so much using, you know, the document retrieval or custom queries to get to their work. They're starting to use dashboards to do so because, to Dan's point, you can base these results on certain cues where we know they have certain actions that they may need to perform. We know we can limit them by who they're assigned to. We know we can set up from Dan's configuration of that new data provider. We can have it respect security keywords. We can have it respect permissions with inside of a load balanced queue. So those are all important things to keep in mind when we think about, not only are we displaying your existing data and processes in a way that's easy to digest, but it allows you to, in a point and click manner, change those on a whim, add whatever additional information you need to extract out of there. And one of the things that we haven't touched on yet, Dan, is just the ability to report on data that's outside of OnBase too. So, you had kind of referenced how sometimes we create data providers for workview applications, and that's simply by creating a filter, and it's essentially a cheat code, right? And it creates a table for us, and we say, here's the data I want from this table. And when we create that data provider, it's a simple SQL data provider, the same way that you would interact with any data outside of OnBase as well. So I saw a couple of different questions come through, and one of them is, let's try and pick a good one. So this is kind of an open-ended question, Dan, but it's how do I get my dashboard items to look right? That's kind of an open-ended. So I'm going to take some artistic license with that question, and kind of talk through, I think, some of our best practices when we're talking about how a dashboard should look or feel. Do you still have your demonstration system up, Dan?
Yep.
Can you go into the design mode? And while these are dashboards that are included, right out of the box, we can provide that link to anyone in attendance. And there's a ton of different things that you can do to ensure that you have clean and correct data on these. So I don't know necessarily how these are built behind the scenes, right? But if Dan wanted to, I think he knows where I'm going, click on any one of these and look at how the data is filtered, that's probably a really good example of how we can make our data look right. So within each aspect of a dashboard, if he right clicks on those and selects edit filter, you then have the ability to edit the data that is being displayed within here. So a very common one, and you mentioned this earlier, Dan, was hey, I don't want information that is in this queue. Maybe it's hidden, or maybe it's an exceptions queue, or it's old and no longer being used, or whatever the case may be. You can limit that that scenario. And that's a very simple case of the way that we would do that. Or, if there's an unassigned object in the queue, we would want to take that out of a queue that shows the user assignment and show that in a separate part that simply says, hey, here are the cases that are unassigned. And it's really good for when you want to split that data out, right? So let's say Dan were to go into that pie chart in the upper right, and he wanted to turn that into two separate. He can simply right click, he can duplicate this, and then within one, he could edit the filter to only show the count for exceptions, and in the other, only show the counts for non-exceptions. So it really kind of shows one simple way you can go about making sure that only the correct data is being shown. Another way that, I've noticed folks in the past have struggled with something simple is simply how you name your data, how you name your columns and the like, and then it can start to be confusing as to what data is actually here. And one easy way to do that is exactly, Dan, as we look into this grid here, one of these ways is right click and rename it here, but then you may forget what data that truly is. So an easy way to do that here, and a lot of these are going to be in that right click functionality, is right click, and we'll have to stay out of the lower in there. But if you go to edit names, now you have complete control over all of the different column names, so that naturally when you put something in like the entry date, and then you want to set that to day, month, year, you can remove that parenthesis if you're trying to get that column a little bit tighter. I think everyone knows that based off the format, it's day, month, year. You don't need to spell that out for them. Some additional ways that we've done that in the past is just some of the out of the box functionality that you can get within each one of these parts of the dashboard. So if Dan goes up to the top in the ribbon and goes to the design aspect for this, one easy way he can set the way that it looks is to auto fit these to a grid, auto fit the contents, and then it's just going to naturally look more appealing to the eye. The last bit I would say is, in general, this seems a little bit busy to me. And again, we did create an additional pie graph. And I know it can be tempting to try and get as much information onto the screen as possible, but it becomes an aspect of, Dan, you said this the other day, and it reminds me, analysis paralysis. And you're unable to make decisions from this. One other quick one that I always find useful, Dan, is in your graph in the top left, being able to just simply remove a label from that. So if we go into the y-axis settings of this, what we can do is simply remove the label, and it's up in the ribbon, Dan. Oh, did we get a frozen screen on you? Oh, we may have lost Dan. Well, ultimately what happens if we get onto the x-axis settings, you just have a simple checkbox that says, yep, we can take this label out. And then additionally, at the very top, in the overall dashboard settings, a lot of times it's necessary to name the dashboard itself. The users of the dashboard know what they're accessing, and they don't need the name at the top. So with a little bit of technical difficulties, I'm going to try and answer our remaining questions. Let's see here. Configuring the ability to click open objects. That was a good one that was actually answered by Dan already. Configure constraints on the dashboard object. Looks like, I believe we answered that as well. I'll tell you what, I apologize for the technical difficulties we ran into today. I will end the webinar now. If any additional questions, well, I won't end it now, but if any additional questions pop up, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself, Dan, your account manager, our marketing team. I hope this session was helpful to the folks who attended. And I'd like to thank Dan for creating those reference videos, sharing his insights with us today, and to all of you for your attendance and questions. As a reminder, attendees will see a survey about today's webinar that will launch after we conclude this session. And again, please watch your email for today's recording as well as the narrated videos we saw at the beginning of the session. On behalf of CureWorks, I thank each of you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.